I'm unused to being ready to start.
Yep. In fact, we are now live on air with an episode that started off as attempted homicide, life on the street, and then became eventually a homicide, life on the streets by the end of the episode. So over to Jeff, because a little bit of a problem with this episode was, like, you know, them having jurisdiction when really it should have gone back to sex crimes. But, you know, it's been established at the end of the previous season that, they're just moving all people all around, all over the place. So, you know, they don't really care about jurisdiction. So over to Jeff.
As I was saying,
Yes.
I'm unused to. You send me the Hangout link, and then I click on it, and you're actually ready to start. It usually takes a while.
Yep.
So I figured, I can click on it while I'm still eating, because he won't be ready to start.
Oh.
And then you were.
Well, I mean, it makes it sound interesting for people. So,
I almost did a spit take when you said that.
It does make it sound interesting. And so I will, whilst Jeff is eating some stuff, I will go through some of the slides, and then Jeff can, I'll go through some of the slides, and then, and I'll tell people what I think, and then Jeff can go over to, like, David B226 Morris. I don't know.
Hey, you got it the first time, man.
And
this is an unusual hangout for multiple reasons.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's my stage play, folks. There it is. It's on Lulu. Wilma and Reno. Right.
All right.
Right. So then, we are now going to show you the most interesting bit about this for me was the stuff about Kellerman. And also, I think they got his hair right. Right, what have got? VLC snaps. I do believe they got his hair right. So what I mean by that is, let's cut all these out. They're in that folder, and they are in the hangouts that I do with Jeff are in a particular folder, season 6, 6.06. Because before, I think they got his hair right. It's not, because before in previous seasons, he's woken up with nicer hair than he had in this episode. Because it was over, because they had the hair and makeup person, you know, overly make them look too attractive. And they probably realized, you know, he's an ESTP, let's go with his hair. So this kind of, like, is that? Yeah, that's visible. Yeah, that's visible. Natural kind of hair. Where we go? Ooh, I'm going to go back to this point right here. As soon as I saw that, I thought I recognised Kellerman, and part of it is his hair, is his ear there as well, the way his ear goes. Definite SP traits from this Georgia Rae, I think she's called, where she was talking about liking action movies and stuff. So I'd say she's definitely an SP. Then we have a little preview there of I think this was Stivers, I believe she's called, writing the report. I believe it was Stivers. And it looks like Microsoft Word there. Yes, it even says Microsoft Word. All right. Yeah, I mean, I would think a little bit more on her would have been nice. Let's see, is Jeff around? Yes, he's around. He's just switched his mic off. So yes, I will go through this, folks. Give you my thoughts, and then we'll go over to. Right. So we have here. So we start off with this woman. She's been drinking. Well, first of all, it shows her, they find her, and then they do sort of flashbacks to her drinking. Alison Folland. Is she pretentious? Will she call herself Falsone? We don't know. Then we've got... now we've got Bayliss going for the smart boy image rather than the pretty boy image. So it's like now he's, I don't know if he's thinking, oh, I've lost weight, but I don't want to go back to being the pretty boy. I'll be the pretty and the smart boy. Alright, where we go? And of course, some of these names. Alison Fallon. Now, Tony Lewis. I wonder if that's Stivers. I'm not quite sure. Stivers. Right. And Hazel Goodman. I'm not quite sure who she is, but I know who Harvey Bramson is by now. And then you've got these people. Do you have any comments on these names, Jeff?
John Whitesell is the doctor. I've momentarily forgotten the character's actual name, but the doctor at the hospital, the ER doctor.
Right.
The one that gives Falsone the news that the girl died.
Yeah. Also, that doctor, was he the one who was in a previous episode? Was he in Doll's Eyes?
Yes, he's been in several previous episodes.
Yeah.
He was the one that also when Chris Thorman got shot.
Ah, right.
Back in the first season. So he's been in several episodes.
Yeah. Right then. Abby Bramson is the wife of Frank Pendleton. Wonder about. I wonder if they pay him less for the scenes with his wife, because it's like, come on, you're not really acting here. Come on, we'll pay half pay.
I'm pretty sure that he was on salary regardless.
Yes. Yes. Julie Martin. Yes. Do you think there were any things in this story that were like hallmarks of Julie Martin? Because you know the series to such a depth, Jeff, that you might think, oh, this is the sort of thing that this kind of writer does or that kind of writer does.
Well, maybe. I mean, the one thing that I really thought was this is an episode that, just on its face, that there might be some people that would object to in terms of the way that the women are portrayed. And they have an immediate defense for that because they say, hey, it was not only written, it was directed by a woman also. So you can't say this was just the boys' club comments about women.
Yeah, and plus it's got. I mean, that might have some validity to it if you didn't have the Cox character in there, who's quite important to the plot. And I very much like her as an actress, Michelle Forbes, and she has so much presence. Again, they used her to play the character of Admiral Kane, who was in charge of Adama in Battlestar Galactica. So she was like a real strong ESTP character in Battlestar Galactica. Right. So, moving on. But yeah, I mean, but yeah, I just wondered if there were like any pieces of dialogue you thought, oh yes, I'll read out a bit. I wrote down a bit, and I don't know, Jeff, if you have the story behind this, whether it was Julie Martin or whether Yaphet Kotto did it, but there was a bit where, and I'll try and read it out in my Yaphet Kotto voice.
Well, before you do that,
Right.
I just wanted to say my usual introduction that this is season 6, episode 6 of Homicide: Life on the Street. It was actually broadcast 4th, though, so this was broadcast before the Law and Order crossover and the Subway episode originally. Which I think that makes one thing interesting in that you have the stuff with George Rae Mahoney was more fresh on people's mind at the time this aired. But I think it works better as it was produced, in that there's a little bit of time to kind of have other things, and then you kind of bring that story back, like, you know, hey, this hasn't died, so I kind of like that. But it was originally aired November 7th, 1997, written by Julie Martin and directed by Allison McLean.
Also, there's the thing that ties it in, where you've got Falsone, who's trying to prove himself. And then he's talking about that he's saying, and Falsone is saying to G that he can handle the heat. And then I'll try and do I've got to concentrate to try and do my G voice. So far, you've handled the heat of a camp stove. I'm talking about white-hot explosions, solar rays, fireballs bursting from the face of the sun, the kind of heat that would incinerate a man, his career, instantly. I like that bit. I can't really do him justice. He's got a great voice as Yaphet Kotto.
Right. There's nobody else that quite sounds like him.
Brilliant. And he'd be perfect in, like, perfect in Blake 7. It's like, or just anything that calls for that kind of, like, American theatre standard kind of voice. Right, he'd be good in, like, a Game of Thrones type role. A sort of Shakespearean type role. Right, so getting back to the grabs, and then we'll get to David B26 Morris, or whatever it's called. Is it 226? Is it got a double 2 in there?
Yeah.
Right.
Except we won't for this episode because he doesn't appear to have written one.
Oh!
There is, however, another comment by somebody named F. Brown 649. It's not quite as thorough as Mr. Morris, but it does have some comments on the episode.
Right.
Find an actual summary of the episode. But I guess the gist of it is there's a woman that has been attacked and beat up badly and assaulted sexually. There's not semen, so there's not evidence in that capacity as to who it was. And the first scenes of the episode, they sort of make the bartender come off kind of creepy, but then they show this other creepier looking guy. So the idea is the audience focuses on, and the detectives focus on the other guy who's been convicted of such things before, and probably will be again from the scene they showed towards the end of the episode of that guy looking like he's, scoping out some more women.
And interestingly enough, you actually had, and this is something that it's just you mentioned there, scoping out other women. You've actually got Lewis, who has an eye for the ladies, and he's scoping out this woman.
Yeah.
And then you got the doll's eyes guy.
Yeah, that's Sean Whitesell, as the actor. So he's appeared in several episodes to this point. And what you were saying about Kellerman earlier, I couldn't comment on because I was kind of in the middle of something. But his hair, I think that could reflect also that the extra stress he's under.
Yeah, it's like he's been on like a boat after sex with cops, and he's woken up. Like in previous seasons, he'd wake up with like perfect hair, and that's
it's like those things where, you know, time goes in reverse, or somebody's born as an old man and then grows to a baby or whatever. You know, it's like he wakes up with perfect hair, and then, you know, he messes it up as the day goes on.
Yeah, and also, and that was in like previous seasons where the hair was a bit longer as well. And I just think that this hairstyle fits his character more. But that's just
Yeah, I think they kind of make some cosmetic changes to the detectives that sort of reflect that the job and the stress of the job kind of can affect the way that they look over time. Because you can see the same thing with Bayless, where he doesn't look like the wide-eyed kid that he looked like when he first showed up at Homicide.
Yeah.
Now with the slightly graying hair and the glasses, you know, he almost looks like he's like a college professor guy or something.
Yeah, and also that might be, Jeff, because of his type. Do you think that ISFJ is they're guardians and they want to be taken seriously as well? Because all guardians want to be taken seriously, and in socionics, the idea is that ISFJs can have a problem with TE, with sort of like extroverted thinking, because they care more about people. And so, do you think that they do want to try to present a sort of a more business-like side to them? I don't know what your experience of ISFJs is in that area.
So there's a certain kind of you know, I don't know a nicer word for it. I call it phoniness, but it's not like necessarily phoniness in like a deceptive way. It's just more like they want to give off that image. So you hear things like a different voice when on the phone with someone trying to sound more formal as opposed to casual conversation. When you're talking any kind of professional or business transaction, you know, they're going to kind of put on a little bit of a something.
Yeah, and I don't know if they probably use the term in the United States, the telephone voice.
Right. Yeah, and I really don't have much of a different voice on the telephone, but there are plenty of people that do. So
yours is just awesome all the while, Jeff.
Well, true. I'm glad you recognize that. Not everybody does.
In fact, it's so awesome that sometimes your son tries to like copy it as well when he's.
I don't know about that, but Hazel Goodman, by the way, is the actress who plays Georgia Mahoney.
Ah. I think maybe the actress and certainly the characters in SP, maybe the actresses as well. Who she plays.
Well, that wouldn't be surprising considering a ton of actors are SPs. So.
Yep, it's certainly ESFPs are sort of like lined up to naturally be inclined to performing, hence the role variant performer. So the Mahoney thing was very interesting. She actually,
I actually liked those scenes. Especially when Kellerman was, you know, researching the surveillance system stuff. That seemed really realistic for not only the character, but, you know, the show, just to discuss those things. Because I like that better than the melodramatic aspects of their conversations.
Right.
Because, you know, her as a character, not saying the actress, but just the character is a little over the top. And being, you know, twirling the mustache, melodrama villain kind of thing.
A bit Miami voice, I suppose.
So that in itself is less interesting to me than the actual actions related to that. So Kellerman doing the research into the surveillance system, like I enjoyed those scenes more.
One thing I can say is now it could almost have been like a Columbo kind of thing, but she's not strategic. But if she was like an NT, the Columbo twist would have been, and she would have said to Kellerman, I've not actually got film of you killing my brother, but I have got film of you going there to check the cameras out because you thought, you know, that kind of thing.
Well,
where
stay tuned.
you know what I mean? Because that's the sort of thing that happened in one of the, because you know you get these kind of endings in they happen a lot, you know, where people do it's almost like the thing with like an impeachment where they don't get done for the original crime, they get done for the cover up. And it's like the person in the act of like where they would only do something if they were guilty, rather than so they have the evidence. Yeah.
So without spoiling anything, really, I will say that this is not the last of the plot line about that.
That's good because I like that. I like the Mahoney stuff and the continuing.
Well, stay tuned because this season will have quite a bit of characters experiencing lots of stuff related to that.
And what they could have done, I mean, I can see the potential where if they'd have written this character slightly better, this Mahoney's sister, where that would be like a real good like adversary for Kellerman. It's like an ESTP versus ESTP thing. And so, can you imagine that, Jeff? How this could have been really, really, really good, like how you would have written it better.
I mean, I'm honestly, no, I guess because I can't get past the way that character was presented, that I just don't really like that character, so I don't see a lot of potential with it.
Mate.
I would have gone in different directions.
Yeah, maybe like write the character slightly differently. How would you have written this character? Maybe still make her an ESTP, but
I would have had, you know, more of a colder, more calculated kind of presentation. She almost could have been the anti-Luther in terms of, whereas, you know, she could have been talking about how Luther always wanted to be like, you know, smooth looking and he cared too much about his image, and I was the one in the background doing the real work. You know, it could have been more like that, as opposed to her kind of being more over the top than Luther was.
I was just thinking, like, what would be the kind of character that would be the perfect challenge for Kellerman?
Well, that kind of is to me. Is that somebody who maintains their composure the whole time, whereas he's losing his.
Yeah.
You know, somebody that doesn't come across as. I mean, I don't know. It sort of works in the sense that she gets under his skin by sort of taunting him with things. So you know, it's effective in that way, I guess.
Do you think it's almost the roles that they're in? Like, I mean, I think she's an ESTP. It's almost as if because she's a criminal, she has more flexibility to do ESTP-ish things, you know, adaptive things, whereas he has to be more by the book. He has to be more by the system. And it would almost help maybe if he was an SJ, because they're better at using the system, maybe, than... I don't know about that, because SPs are good at being creative within the system.
Morgan is not here to comment, but what he said while seeing this episode with me again the other night was that he only basically expressed that it's hard for him to watch because of what they did to Kellerman. The way he looks at it, he says he keeps saying things like the writers screwed over Kellerman. So he's resentful towards the way that his character was portrayed in all this.
Well, he really does identify with him, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's very obvious that he does. So it hits him personally.
Yeah, but it's almost like saying, Morgan, you're not supposed to have this projection thing. That's what INFPs do. You're really projecting a connection there.
Well, you know, it's not a good idea for any SP for you to tell them what they're supposed to do and not do.
Oh, I know that. Right.
I thought she was good, the victim.
Yeah, she was interesting.
Because again, what I was saying at the beginning about, you know, the women writing and directing this is that, and there's another episode later this season that covers not exactly the same themes as this one, but it's similar in the sense where it's about the choices of a woman in terms of the position she puts herself in, not in a way that puts blame blame on her for being victim of a crime, but in the sense that they still talk about, you know, in this episode, Cox talks about it at the bar with Munch about, you know, putting yourself in the position to be more vulnerable to crime.
Oh, yeah.
So I like the fact that the show covers that from the angle where there's not like this agenda of, you know, we're trying to make it seem like we're trying to, you know, hit the audience over the head with, you know, women who are raped, you know, are not to blame for this happening, but they're also not like making it out to be, you know, there's something morally wrong with this woman for doing this either. They're just giving you the facts and showing what people's realistic interpretations of that behavior are from those characters. Yeah. So that's what I like about it.
Yeah, you know, make it less easy for the predators.
Right. So they talk about that, but it's not in a, you know, and you know, Cox even says directly, you know, I'm not saying she's responsible for this happening to her, but at the same time, she is looking at the character of, you know, that wouldn't happen to me because I don't just, you know, go home with men I meet in bars. You know?
But she did say that she worries about herself getting drunk.
Right. So she's saying that, but then she's also sort of asking herself, you know, would this happen to me because am I being too reckless with, you know, my own personal life, or have I been, you know?
Yeah, and
so
then she's
sort of throwing that out there.
Yeah, and she also said that she tries to push that aside and believe, you know, so she's got a little bit of inner doubt herself. Mm-hmm. And you've talked before how you believe that she's an SP.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I think she's probably an ESFP. So it's another example of a character that is is demonstrating, you know, there might be some stereotypes that she's more in line with, but she's, you know, not across the board. You know, just as I said, Pemberton gave an example of how would an ESFP be as a police detective. Well, she's, you know, how another ESFP in a professional situation, you know, she's risen to the point of chief medical examiner. So she's obviously had to do a lot of work and a lot of maturing in many ways, but she still has a personal life where she even herself can look at it and say, you know, there's some things that maybe I'm not making the wisest decisions about.
Yeah, and this grab is Holly in a hangout that we did yesterday, folks, on an ENFJ Enneagram Type 2. So, but this is Falsone, proving himself, just blowing his cheeks out after Yaphet Kotto did a nice bit of poetry that I read out before.
Yeah, and I thought there was a good exchange between him and Cox in this episode, because you get a little bit of insight into his character. Because, like I said, I still think he's probably ISTP, and you saw, but you've seen a little bit of his feeling side.
Yeah.
But it's not been, you know, it's been similar to, closer to Bayless than Pemberton. I'll put it that way. In terms of, he has this kind of righteous indignation about certain things. And it doesn't mean he doesn't relate to other characters, because we've had, you know, scenes where he, you know, relates to fathers. You know, he's got a kid of his own, things like that. But in this scene, he when he's talking to Cox, he basically has said that he's trying to prove himself. When she says he's trying too hard, like basically he's similar to kind of the way Bayless was at the beginning. He's kind of trying to be like, I've got to show that I'm this, you know, detective who's really going to push things, you know, until I get my case solved, because he's trying to prove to the other people in the squad that he's a good detective, and that he's not just this chump from Auto Squad that you know, they shouldn't trust or shouldn't rely on. So it's very much trying to fit in more than it is he's trying to really establish his own independent viewpoint. So it's he's driven, but in a much different way than Pemberton.
Do you think maybe it's either way is very close on F versus T? He's certainly got a strong feeling side.
I would say that definitely he either, you know, he's more that way to begin with, or he's developed it over time. You know, and I think, you know, probably becoming a father plays a factor in that, because I know that always, you know, that could have possibly given him more empathy towards, you know, parents with children, you know, things like that.
Do you think also it is a bit of a cultural thing? I mean, which culture are they saying he's from? Are they saying he's
Italian.
Italian. So Italian is going to be more family oriented. A little bit more of the feeling side is encouraged in that culture. I spoke with a Spanish person who told me that that Italians are way more expressive than Spanish people, and people think that the Spanish people are expressive, just not as expressive as Italians, who are pretty much the most expressive. But family being a big thing in Italian culture. And G has talked a little bit about that in some of his monologues earlier on, about the Italian side of his family.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, I mean non-type factors as well. But to me, the way I would type him so far would be as an SFP, based on what I've seen so far.
And I can understand that, that perspective also. When I saw the gravestone, I was like, man, somebody spent some money on that. that's over the top as well. Yeah, I could see the SFP designation for Falsone, but to me, this episode kind of, like I said, I feel like it sort of confirms I was right in the other direction, is that he cares more about fitting in than he does about any kind of personal crusade. And you'll see that contrast not only with Pendleton, but also with Lewis later in this season. That Lewis is definitely the type that goes on the personal crusade more than it is. He doesn't care about whether his image as much with the other detectives.
I think part of it is the actor. The actor's okay. He's not quite. Obviously, he's not as good as Frank Pendleton is.
But what I've noticed is STPs care more about their image than SFPs do, and people on the surface level, might not believe that, because they're like, well, there's a lot of SFPs that are into like fashion or the trying to look cool or things like that, and that's true. But that's more about personal expression than it really is about trying to fit into anybody else's expectations of that. It's more like being independent and doing this thing that is fun. Whereas it seems like STPs, and they can lament their own desires. I've heard Morgan say many times he doesn't like the fact that he feels like doing that, but he calls himself a poser.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the thing is they sort of have this thing where they need to be seen a certain way. They want to be seen as cool, but they want to also be seen as effective and skilled at something.
Yeah.
So there's very much more of a I've got to prove myself kind of attitude, which is why a lot of STPs are so successful as athletes, because they're constantly driven to prove to people that they're going to be the best at what they're doing. Yeah,
and also that cognitively what they're best at fits sport so much in terms of extroverted sensing. I like the way Dario Nardi defines it as immersing yourself in the present context. So it's like the more pressure there is, the more focused they are, the better they perform. The bigger the game, the better they play. And then there's also the in terms of like the game smarts, like the tactical intelligence.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to know the difference between SFP versus STP athlete, I would say sometime just watch interviews with Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. There's two people that were contemporaries in the same sport, somewhat similar backgrounds, so you don't have as much of the difference there. But if you see the difference in what they say inspires them, motivates them, just their attitude in interviews, very different. So you can see the contrast of what really sort of drives them, and the number of times that Magic Johnson will smile when talking about high pressure situations versus Jordan having a very intense look on his face, like he's proud of conquering things, And also even their Hall of Fame speeches, in terms of the way they were perceived. Jordan's was perceived as if he was angry, even though I don't think he was, but the people saw it that way. Whereas Magic Johnson was always the jovial, friendly, you know, showman guy. So it's very different, even in both being artisans, both being athletes, both having somewhat similar backgrounds. But the way that their personalities come through is different.
Right. I think that.
Do you have any pictures of Pembleton at the hospital? Because I think we can talk about that briefly.
I think I have. I don't think so.
Okay. Apparently, that part of the story didn't make much of an impact on Ben, but I would say I don't know if you had any thoughts about that scene where he talks to Bayless about being in the emergency room, waiting room, or being in the hospital, because they have a little brief conversation about that.
Oh yeah, what I did is I heard that while I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, so I actually concentrated quite well on that. So because I can remember certain bits, so I can comment on the oral acting from Pembleton being very good. When he found out that he has a son, that was just the joy at now having a son, and how worried he was when she had some difficulties with the birth.
And we have different sides to him coming out in this scene because he's conflicted over what makes him feel good in the workplace, in terms of he likes the challenge in Homicide versus the Robbery Squad, where he was bored. But he liked the fact that he could come home to his wife every day and have time with his wife and his kids.
Yeah. So yeah, another thing for showing that he's an SFP rather than an STP, I suppose.
So he's talking to Bayless. He's almost arguing with Bayless, but at the same time, it's almost like he's sort of arguing with himself.
Oh yes.
That Bayless is sort of representing the part of him, because he's reminding him, this is how you were when you're in Robbery. You were bored. You didn't like it. So even at point blank at one point asked him, "Are you going to quit Homicide?" But he's sort of being his own devil's advocate in terms of challenging himself. Like, this Homicide may be what inspires you, but is it what's best for your family?
Maybe he could have said maybe in a couple of years, because that would have like a meta level of when the series is over.
Well, again, without spoiling things, I would say that they're laying the groundwork in several characters' cases for, decisions or changes that may come as far as people deciding what to do with their careers.
In fact, we could have a look at the real life, because you've read the book. In the real life, because you've read the book, in real life, is it a case of these detectives that would have talked about these things, issues with their families? Do they have the same issues in real life with not enough time with their families?
Oh,
do
sure,
do they move on to like desk jobs and other types of jobs to have more time with their families?
I mean, there's definitely some discussion of that in the book, and I'm glad you brought that up, because even your impression of Yaphet Kotto, I think, if not word for word, that scene, the stuff he says is pretty close to stuff in the book, because there's an incident in the book where there was like a argument over jurisdiction of a case, and so it's kind of similar, where they basically say, in general, the cops will, if they have an opportunity to unload a case on a different department, they'll do that because they're overworked. But that sometimes a particular detective will be so focused on a particular case, so they don't want to give it up because they feel like they're so immersed in it. And in the book is actually the guy that Bolander was based on, that is you know, into the, there's one case that's really troubling him, and at one point, you know, I can't remember now if it's actually the sergeant or the lieutenant, but I think some of the stuff that G was saying about, you know, cases that could destroy your career or things like that. It's some of those lines, if not all of them, were out of that. I think it was sounded extremely familiar. So, which is kind of why it sounds a little different than the other stuff in the episode, because it may not have that part may not have been written by Julie Martin.
Yeah. Yeah, I just found it very poetic.
Yeah. And there's some things like that in the book. David Simon kind of will go off on little tangents a little bit. And it's also because part of it is written in second person, where it's talking like you are the one in this situation, both as a detective and as a suspect, which we heard a lot in the documentary when you had the scenes of the cops talking to the suspect, the pretend suspect, when they were like acting it out in the box. A lot of that stuff was right out of the book, and it was like, you know, you're in this situation. You, the reader, are the suspect. So he did that with both suspects and with detectives, because the book starts with putting you in the position of being a homicide detective and saying, you know, you're sitting at your desk trying to figure out this, trying to look at this evidence and find the one clue that's going to solve this thing. Meanwhile, you've got, you know, another one of the detectives is saying some stuff at you that's not relevant. One of your bosses is yelling at you for some other thing, you know, and saying, and generally what the bosses are saying is that their bosses are giving them flack about whatever, so they're giving it on to you, which, you know, that was covered from the beginning with when Pemberton and G had a conversation in the very first episode, where Pemberton says, so they kick you, you kick me, right? And then G says, well, look at it this way, now you can kick Felton. But that reminds me, because I was gonna say a difference between Falsone and Felton, because dude, in this situation, in this particular case, if Felton had the case, he would have been one of those that would have said, okay, give it to sex crimes. Episode where he showed up and there was no body because the guy had been taken to the hospital, wasn't dead or whatever. And so Felton says to the uniform cop, you know, next time when you call homicide, you know, there needs to be a body. You know, basically, like,
oh yeah,
I forgot how he said it exactly, but he was like, don't, if there's no dead guy, then don't call homicide.
yeah. I mean, that was a bit. I mean, to me, that was like really stretching credibility. I mean, it's like it's gonna have to go to sex. There's no body yet.
Well, but it was believable, because that does happen when you have somebody who makes that call where they think, oh, they're seconds away from death. So they're like, what? I mean, what would you do in that situation? You're like, okay, you know, you can go ahead and take him to the hospital. Way, then, and that's kind of what I wondered, is about how many times, because they don't tend to have very many episodes that cover that concept. Because obviously there's quite a few people who die on the way to the hospital. Brought up, like, when it happens, you know, what do they do as far as, because they can't examine the body at the scene because they're no longer at the scene.
Yeah, I just thought that there was that bit where, you know, it should have gone back to sex crimes halfway through when she was alive. Maybe they could have written something as, oh, she might die. Maybe they could have keyed up that she might die.
Well, and that was kind of the point that G made. He said, you know, if this, if for now we're going to work together because we don't know.
Right.
And so they made it almost like sort of a political thing, where the departments were sort of batting it back and forth, but he was going to take a stand because he's a supervisor in position as well as type. So he's just going to emphatically state, this is how we're going to do it for now. But even he, like in the scene you were quoting, is basically saying at that point he's ready to give it up, because he's saying this is not going to be a closed homicide case, so we're going to pass it back to them, because she's not dead, so we can get away with turning this back over to them. pushes for keeping him as the primary on the case.
In general, in terms of jurisdiction, does homicide have precedence?
I don't know, but it would make sense if they did, considering they've sort of said it's considered like the elite unit of the police force. But then again, I don't know what the rotation thing that they implemented, what effect that has on that.
Do you think that might have been that at the time, there were fewer women in the police force, and most of the victims of sex crime were going to be women, and so it would be more difficult to handle those kinds of crime?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because you know what I mean. Because you can imagine for a police department in the past, it would have been difficult. How do they recruit people to deal with sex crimes? And they would prefer to have more women involved.
I could be real cynical about it and say they recruited the most perverted members of the police force. But anyway.
Yeah, but you can see what I mean, though. Like, people would want to work homicide. A lot of men might feel uncomfortable working.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
So
I know that when it comes to vice cops or what do you want to call it, they do try to recruit women for, if nothing else, because they often will use female cops undercover in those type of situations to try to trap somebody who's got a pattern of sex crimes. So they not only want to find women, but they want to try to find at least somewhat attractive women. Be effective bait in those situations.
Right, I don't know what else to say about this episode. In terms of, I'll give it about a 7.
And I will also give it a 7. So the average is 7. Join us next time for an episode which has some cool elements as well as some frustrating ones. I'll put it that way. And it's called Saigon Rose.
Right, so that's Saigon, not Zygon.
Right.
Saigon Rose. Although Zygon Rose would have been cool.
Although Saigon is probably not how that word is really written or spelled or pronounced in the language it comes from anyway, but
yeah.
For what it's worth.
But it would have been interesting for Zygon Rose. A female, because I remember those in the Doctor Who. There was a bit where it was, open the door. Yes, all right. And it was very well realised. So Terror of the Zygons is a well-produced episode.
After a couple of episodes where Gardy, I don't think, was even in it at all, he'll be back in the next one.
Right then, so folks, so that's
Saigon
Rose, not Zygon Rose. But you can also see Terror of the Zygons. Bye, folks.
Bye.